wind didn't just howl. It screamed like a dying animal tearing through the Cascade Mountains. Inside the pitch-black cavern, 16-year-old Declan pressed his back against the reinforced stone door, feeling the sheer terrifying weight of the avalanche outside. The temperature beyond the limestone walls had plummeted to 30 below zero, a deadly whiteout that was actively burying the town of Elkhorn alive. Beside him, 9-year-old Hazel fed another piece of scavenged pine into the glowing cast-iron stove. Just 3 weeks ago, the townsfolk had laughed at them, calling them dirty orphans playing make-believe in the dirt. Tonight, the laughter was dead replaced by the desperate realization that the children they had mocked were the only ones who saw the end coming. The Elkhorn Youth Transitional Facility was less of a home and more of a holding pen for the unwanted. Nestled in the shadow of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, the crumbling brick building perpetually smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial bleach. For Declan and his younger sister Hazel, it was a purgatory they had endured for 3 agonizing years since the car accident on State Route 20 that had violently stripped away their parents. Declan was 16 with eyes the color of chipped flint and a jawline set in permanent defiance. He had learned early that the system didn't care about grief. It only cared about compliance. Hazel at 9 was a fragile ghost of a child who rarely spoke, her small hands perpetually clutching a frayed corduroy rabbit their mother had made. They were a unified front, bonded by trauma and a fierce unspoken promise that they would never let the state tear them apart. But in the second week of October, 1998, that promise was directly threatened. Declan had been fixing a broken radiator in the hallway, a chore he volunteered for just to keep out of the common room, when he overheard the facility director, Mrs. Grayson, speaking through the cracked door of her office. Mrs. Grayson was a woman whose empathy had dried up decades ago, replaced by a rigid adherence to state budgets. Sitting across from her was Miss Higgins, a county social worker. "The boy is aging out soon anyway." Mrs. Grayson's voice drifted out, clipped and cold. "He's disruptive, fights with the older kids, but the girl Hazel, we have a foster family down in Seattle willing to take her by the end of next month. A clean break is best. They shouldn't be codependent." Declan stopped breathing. His wrench slipped clattering loudly against the linoleum. He didn't wait to hear the rest. He ran to the girls' dormitory, grabbed Hazel by her fragile wrist, and pulled her out the back fire exit before anyone could stop them. They ran past the rusted swing sets, past the chain-link fence, and up into the dense, unforgiving pine forests that bordered the town. Declan didn't stop until his lungs burned, and the facility was nothing but a speck of gray in the valley below. They collapsed near the edge of the old abandoned limestone quarry, a place forbidden to the town's children. "Declan, it hurts," Hazel whimpered, rubbing her wrist. "Why are we running?" Declan dropped to his knees, gripping her shoulders. "They're going to separate us, Hayes. They're taking you to Seattle. I won't let them do it. I swear on Dad's grave I won't let them take you." Hazel's eyes widened in sheer panic, tears welling up instantly. No, Deck, please don't let them." "I won't," he promised, though he had absolutely no idea how to stop the grinding machinery of the state. He stood up, pacing the rugged terrain, kicking angrily at the shale. As he kicked a particularly large mound of loose rock, it cascaded down a slope, revealing a jagged black fissure in the side of the mountain. Curiosity overriding his panic, Declan pulled out the cheap flashlight he always kept in his jacket. He squeezed through the narrow opening, holding Hazel's hand tightly. The air inside immediately shifted. The biting autumn wind vanished, replaced by a cool, still dampness. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping over smooth limestone walls. It wasn't just a crack. It was an old exploratory mining shaft that had opened into a natural cavern. It was roughly 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough for a grown man to stand. The floor was surprisingly level-packed dirt and crushed stone. What is this place?" Hazel whispered, her voice echoing softly. Declan walked to the back of the cave. He noticed a narrow natural chimney cutting up through the rock toward the surface, likely carved by centuries of water runoff. He looked around the solid stone walls, then down at his trembling sister. A reckless, desperate idea began to take root in his mind. The state couldn't separate them if the state couldn't find them. "It's not just a place, Hazel," Declan said, his voice hardening with sudden, undeniable resolve. "It's our new home. Building a habitable shelter inside a mountain requires more than just willpower. It requires engineering supplies and absolute secrecy." Declan knew they couldn't just sleep on the cold stone. Winter in the Cascades was brutal, capable of dropping temperatures to lethal lows. If they were going to survive off the grid, they needed heat insulation and provisions. Their days fell into a grueling dual existence. By day, they played the part of obedient wards at the Elkhorn facility, avoiding Mrs. Grayson's gaze and eating every scrap of food they could get their hands on. By night, Declan sneaked out through a loose window in the laundry room, embarking on exhausting scavenging runs at the town's municipal landfill. The first and most critical objective was heat. Declan spent 4 agonizing nights digging through rusted scrap metal at the dump until he found it a discarded heavy cast-iron wood stove. It was missing a leg and covered in rust, but the firebox was intact. The real nightmare was transporting it. Weighing nearly 200 pounds, the stove was an immovable beast. Declan managed to steal an old rusted wheelbarrow from behind the town's hardware store, padding it with discarded moving blankets to muffle the sound. It took him 3 nights to push that wheelbarrow up the steep, root-choked trail to the quarry. His hands were blistered and bleeding, his muscles screaming in protest. On the final night, as he neared the tree line, the wheelbarrow struck a rock, tipping over with a loud metallic crash. Well, what do we have here?" Declan froze. 2 flashlight beams hit him directly in the face. It was Kyle and Brody, 2 local high school seniors notorious for tormenting the orphans in town. They had been drinking cheap beer near the quarry. Kyle, a towering boy with a cruel smirk, kicked the overturned stove. "Look at the little mud rat. What are you doing with this garbage orphan trying to build a castle in the dirt?" Brody laughed, shining his light on Declan's torn, filthy clothes. "Maybe he's going to live in a cave like a Neanderthal. That's where trash belongs, right?" Declan clenched his fists, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't afford a fight. If the police were called, his secret would be exposed. "I just found it. I'm fixing it up to sell." Declan lied, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. Kyle sneered, stepping closer. He shoved Declan hard into the dirt. "Nobody wants your garbage rat. Get out of here before we decide to use you as target practice." Humiliated, Declan lay in the dirt until their flashlights disappeared down the trail. He swallowed his pride, wiped the blood from his scraped chin, and spent the next hour dragging the heavy iron stove the rest of the way by hand. The mockery stung, but it fueled him. Every sneer, every insult was a brick in the foundation of his resolve. The next day, the harassment continued in town. Declan and Hazel were walking past Sterling's hardware to buy duct tape with stolen loose change. Mr. Sterling, a portly man who viewed the group home kids as nothing more than petty thieves, stood sweeping his porch. "Keep your hands in your pockets, boy," Mr. Sterling barked as they approached. "I hear you've been digging through the dump like a raccoon. If I catch you stealing from my lot, I'll have the sheriff lock you up faster than you can blink. You orphans are all the same feral." Hazel flinched, hiding behind Declan's leg. Declan just stared the man down, paying for the tape in silence. Let them laugh, he thought. Let them think we're feral. Over the next 3 weeks, the cavern transformed. Declan used the stolen duct tape and discarded PVC pipes from the dump to fashion a crude but effective exhaust system, running it from the wood stove up through the natural rock chimney. He spent days gathering fallen deadwood, chopping it with a rusted axe he'd sharpened on a stone, and hoarding it at the back of the cave. He lined the stone floors with layers of discarded fiberglass insulation wrapped in heavy-duty trash bags, covering them with old carpets to create a barrier against the freezing ground. For food, they slowly siphoned non-perishables from the facility's pantry, cans of baked beans, bags of dry rice, and jars of peanut butter, burying them in plastic bins beneath the cave floor. They rigged a heavy wooden pallet reinforced with scavenged sheet metal to serve as a camouflage door that fit perfectly into the narrow cavern entrance. By mid-November, their haven was a fortified hidden bunker, and not a moment too soon. The clock on Hazel's transfer was ticking down, and the sky above Elkhorn was beginning to turn a bruised, ominous purple. The meteorologists on the crackling AM radio in Mrs. Grayson's office called it an anomalous low-pressure system. The old-timers in Elkhorn just called it a bad squall. The town nestled deep in the valley was accustomed to heavy snow. They had municipal plows, a reliable power grid fueled by the nearby dam, and a sense of rugged arrogance. Mayor Cobb went on the local public access channel on a Tuesday evening, looking relaxed in a flannel shirt. "We're expecting some heavy snowfall later this week, folks," he announced, leaning back in his chair. "Nothing we haven't seen before. Just stock up on a little extra bread and milk, make sure your generators have gas, and we'll ride it out like we always do." Elkhorn stands strong, but Declan knew the town was underestimating the beast that was coming. He had found an old cracked barometer at the dump and hung it in the cave. For 3 days the needle had been dropping so fast he thought the instrument was broken. The air outside felt strangely heavy, tasting of ozone and ice. The animals had vanished. Not a single squirrel or bird could be seen in the woods. Nature was holding its breath. On Thursday morning, the blow finally landed. Declan walked past the administrative office and saw the official state transport vehicle parked out front. Mrs. Grayson was standing on the porch holding a clipboard talking to a man in a thick winter coat. "We'll take the girl at noon," the man said, "before the roads get too icy." Panic, cold, and sharp pierced Declan's chest. Noon. They had less than 4 hours. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted to Hazel's classroom, ignoring the shouting teacher, and grabbed her from her desk. "It's time," he whispered urgently. "We have to go, now." They slipped out the back delivery bay just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. They weren't the soft, lazy flakes of a standard winter shower. They were small, hard pellets of ice that stung exposed skin. The temperature was dropping with terrifying speed. By the time they reached the tree line, the wind had picked up, howling through the pines. Declan practically dragged Hazel up the steep trail, their boots slipping on the rapidly freezing mud. Behind them, the town of Elkhorn continued its daily routine, completely oblivious to the catastrophic atmospheric collision happening directly above their heads. They reached the cavern entrance just as the sky unleashed its fury. It wasn't a snowstorm. It was a whiteout wall of violently swirling ice and snow. Declan shoved Hazel inside the cave, then grabbed the heavy metal-reinforced pallet door. He hauled it into place, the wind screaming, trying to tear it from his grip. With a final agonizing heave, he locked it into the stone grooves, plunging them into absolute darkness. Panting, Declan clicked on his flashlight. The cave was instantly silent, the roaring tempest outside muffled to a dull, distant groan. Hazel was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue. "I got you." Declan breathed, his hands shaking as he struck a match. He touched it to the dry pine needles inside the cast-iron stove. The fire caught immediately, a bright, beautiful orange glow illuminating their subterranean sanctuary. The PVC exhaust worked perfectly, drafting the smoke up and out of the rock chimney. Within 20 minutes, the heavy iron radiated a profound, life-saving heat. They sat on their scavenged carpets, eating cold baked beans straight from the can, listening to the muffled fury outside. Declan checked his watch. It was 1 p.m. Down in the valley, Mrs. Grayson would be realizing they were gone. The police would be called, but no one would look for them in a blizzard. As evening approached, the temperature outside dropped to a historic minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind reached hurricane force, snapping century-old pine trees like dry twigs. Down in Elkhorn, the arrogant comfort of the town was shattering. At 6:14 p.m., under the weight of 3 feet of wet, heavy snow and localized ice storms, the primary transmission lines from the dam failed. In the span of a single heartbeat, the entire valley went pitch black. The grid was dead, furnaces shut off, radiators went cold. Inside the limestone cavern, entirely disconnected from the failing world. Below, the two orphans sat bathed in the warm golden light of their scavenged stove. Hazel leaned her head against her brother's shoulder, the corduroy rabbit clutched in her lap. "Are we going to be okay, Deck?" she asked softly. Declan threw another piece of wood into the fire, listening to the terrifying muffled scream of the blizzard, trying to tear the mountain apart. He thought of Mr. Sterling's sneers, of Kyle's kicks, of Mrs. Grayson's cold eyes. "Yeah, haze," Declan said, his voice hard and steady. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." But the storm of the century was only just beginning, and what neither of them realized was that by day 3, the town that had mocked them would be the one begging for rescue. By the morning of the second day, Friday, the situation in the valley had deteriorated from a severe weather event into a full-blown catastrophe. The anomalous low-pressure system stalled directly over the Cascade Mountains, pulling in moisture from the Pacific and colliding it with an Arctic front. The result was a relentless horizontal barrage of snow that buried Elkhorn under 40 inches in less than 24 hours, with drifts reaching up to second-story windows. Inside the Elkhorn Youth Transitional Facility, the temperature had plummeted to 42 degrees and was still dropping. Mrs. Grayson sat in her office, wrapped in 3 wool blankets, staring at the dead landline phone on her desk. The backup generator, a rusted diesel machine that hadn't been properly serviced in a decade, had sputtered and died at 3 a.m. Mrs. Grayson. She looked up to see 10-year-old Lucas shivering in the doorway, his lips chapped and pale. "What is it, Lucas?" she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual venom, weakened by the biting cold. "The toilets are backing up, and the little kids are crying. We can't feel our toes." Mrs. Grayson closed her eyes, a knot of genuine fear finally tightening in her stomach. "Tell them to huddle in the center of the gymnasium. Bring all the mattresses." She paused, her mind drifting to the 2 empty beds in the boys' and girls' wings. "And Lucas, did Chief Hamilton's deputies find any trace of Declan and Hazel?" Lucas shook his head. "No, ma'am. Deputy Ford said nobody could survive out there. He said they're probably buried under the drifts near the highway." A pang of guilt, foreign and sharp, pierced Grayson's chest. She had called social services to take the girl to save money to clear a headache. Now she had likely sent 2 children to a frozen grave. But she didn't have time to mourn. She had 20 other wards currently freezing to death under her roof. Across town, Mayor Cobb's confident facade had completely shattered. He stood in the emergency dispatch center, a glorified basement under the town hall, illuminated only by the sickly yellow beam of a battery-powered lantern. Chief Hamilton, a burly man whose beard was caked with ice from a brief excursion outside, slammed his radio down on the table. "Nothing?" Hamilton growled, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "The county plow is stuck on Route 20. The driver had to abandon the rig and hike to a farmhouse. The State Emergency Management Agency says they can't get choppers in the air with 0 visibility, and the National Guard Humvees can't punch through the avalanche debris blocking the mountain pass. We are completely cut off, Mayor." Mayor Cobb rubbed his temples. "What about the substation? Can the dam route power back to us?" The transmission towers on the ridge snapped like toothpicks, Hamilton replied grimly. "Half the town is relying on propane, and those tanks are freezing. Sterling's hardware got looted this morning by panicked locals looking for kerosene and firewood. Sterling tried to stop them with a baseball bat, but they just pushed right past him." Mr. Sterling. The man who had threatened to lock Declan up for taking trash was currently sitting in his ransacked store wrapped in a sleeping bag. His own high-end propane heater had run out of fuel because he had failed to top off his tanks before winter, assuming the town's grid would never fail. The ironies of his situation were lost on him. All he felt was a creeping, agonizing numbness in his extremities. The teenagers who had mocked Declan, Kyle, and Brody weren't faring any better. They were trapped in Kyle's basement. The power outage had stopped the sump pump, and the frozen pipes had burst, flooding the floor with 2 inches of freezing water before the main line was finally shut off. Now they were huddled on a couch, burning their old high school yearbooks in a decorative fireplace that offered almost no draft, filling the room with stinging smoke. The arrogance of youth had been violently stripped away, leaving only two terrified boys realizing that popularity and physical strength meant absolutely nothing to the cold. High above the suffering town, safely entombed within the limestone bedrock of the mountain, the reality of the storm was a muffled, distant roar. Inside the cavern, the temperature hovered at a comfortable 65 degrees. The heavy cast-iron stove salvaged from the scrap heap radiated a glorious, life-saving heat. Declan was sitting cross-legged on a scavenged rug, carefully using a stolen pocket knife to whittle a piece of pine into a crude toy for Hazel. Hazel sat nearby, drawing on a piece of scrap paper with a stubby pencil, her cheeks flushed and pink, a stark contrast to the blue-lipped children huddled in the gymnasium down in the valley. They had enough canned food to last 3 weeks, and Declan's meticulous hoarding of firewood meant they wouldn't run out of fuel anytime soon. They were comfortable. They were safe. Until the mountain shook. It started as a low, sub-audible rumble that vibrated up through the soles of Declan's boots. The dust on the limestone ceiling began to sift down like dirty snow. Hazel gasped, dropping her pencil and scrambling over to her brother, burying her face in his chest. "What is that?" she whimpered. "Shh." "Hold on," Declan whispered, wrapping his arms around her. The rumble escalated into a deafening roar that seemed to vibrate the very air inside their lungs. It sounded like a freight train driving directly over their heads. The reinforced pallet door rattled violently in its stone frame. For 10 agonizing seconds, the world ended. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the sound faded, replaced by an eerie, absolute silence. Avalanche. Declan breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs. A big one. It must have swept down the eastern face. He gently pushed Hazel aside and stood up, shining his flashlight toward the pallet door. It was holding. The entrance was secure. He exhaled a long breath of relief. They were fine. But 20 minutes later, Declan noticed something was wrong. The flames in the cast-iron stove, usually a vigorous crackling orange, were burning a sluggish, sickly blue. He rubbed his eyes. A dull, throbbing ache was beginning to bloom at the base of his skull. He looked over at Hazel. She had laid down on the rug, her eyes half closed. "Haze, you sleepy," he asked, his own voice sounding thick and far away to his ears. "Tired," she mumbled, her head lolling to the side. Panic, colder than the ice outside, seized Declan's heart. Carbon monoxide. He looked up at the ceiling, the natural rock chimney that housed his PVC exhaust pipe. The avalanche must have dumped a massive layer of snow over the top of the mountain, completely sealing the ventilation shaft. The smoke and invisible deadly gases were backing up into the sealed cavern. They were slowly suffocating. "Hazel, wake up!" Declan shouted, stumbling toward her. His legs felt like lead. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her. "Don't go to sleep. Open your eyes." Hazel groaned, her eyelids fluttering. Declan knew he had only minutes before they both lost consciousness. He couldn't open the main door. The avalanche debris might have buried it, and if he dislodged it, tons of snow could pour in and crush them. His only option was the chimney. He grabbed a long, heavy iron rod he had salvaged to use as a fire poker. He dragged a heavy plastic storage bin to the back of the cave, directly under the chimney shaft. Fighting through the dizziness and the crushing nausea, he climbed onto the bin. He could just reach the base of the natural rock funnel. He shoved the iron rod up alongside the PVC pipe, thrusting it upward into the darkness. It hit solid resistance about 4 feet up, packed snow, concrete hard from the avalanche pressure. "Come on!" He gritted his teeth, stabbing the rod upward with every ounce of strength in his teenage arms. Thud, thud, thud. His vision began to narrow, the edges going black. He could hear his own ragged breathing echoing in the cave. Down on the floor, Hazel had stopped moving. "I won't let them take you," Declan gasped, repeating his promise like a mantra. "I won't." With a final desperate scream, he drove the iron bar upward with a violent twisting thrust. Crunch. The resistance gave way. The rod punched through the snowpack. Instantly, a blast of freezing, agonizingly cold air shot down the shaft, hitting Declan square in the face. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever felt. He pulled the rod out. The toxic air in the cave rushed up through the newly cleared hole, creating a vacuum that pulled the fresh, icy oxygen down. The flames in the stove immediately flared back to life, turning from sickly blue to a roaring bright orange. Declan collapsed off the bin, hitting the dirt floor hard. He crawled over to Hazel, dragging her closer to the stream of fresh air falling from the ceiling. "Breathe, Hayes, just breathe," he begged, patting her cheeks. After a terrifying minute, Hazel took a deep, shuddering gasp. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and watery. "Deck, my head hurts." Declan pulled her into a fierce hug, burying his face in her hair. I know, but we're okay. We're okay." He looked back at the stove. The ventilation was working again. The cave was safe. But the near-death experience had shaken him to his core. Nature didn't care about his clever engineering or his determination. It was a ruthless, impartial killer. And as the fourth day dawned, Declan was about to realize just how ruthless it had been to the people who didn't have a safe haven. By Sunday morning, the wind finally died down. The storm had spent its fury, moving eastward to terrorize Idaho and Montana. In its wake, it left a profound, devastating silence. The temperature remained brutally low, hovering at 10 degrees below zero. Inside the cave, Declan decided it was safe to check the entrance. They needed more wood from the stockpile he had hidden just outside the cave mouth. He unlatched the heavy wooden pallet. It took him 10 minutes of shoving and digging with a scavenged shovel to clear the snowdrift that had piled up against it. When he finally pushed the door open, the glare of the morning sun reflecting off the pristine, untouched snow nearly blinded him. He stepped out onto the narrow ledge of the old quarry, sinking up to his thighs in the powder. He looked down at the valley, expecting to see the town of Elkhorn digging out. Instead, what he saw made his blood run cold. The town was a frozen graveyard. There was no smoke rising from any of the chimneys. The wet, heavy snow had frozen solid in the flues of the houses, rendering their fireplaces useless and dangerous. Roofs of several commercial buildings on Main Street had caved in under the weight. The roads were completely obliterated, indistinguishable from the fields. The avalanche he had felt the day before had completely wiped out the eastern access road and crushed the town's water tower. "They're dying down there," Declan whispered to himself, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He gathered an armful of wood and went back inside, sealing the door behind him. He sat in front of the warm stove, staring into the flames. "What's wrong, Dec?" Hazel asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "The town," Declan said slowly. "They don't have power. They don't have heat." Hazel looked down at her corduroy rabbit. She remembered the taunts, the cruelty, the cold eyes of Mrs. Grayson, and the rough hands of the boys who had pushed her brother. "They were mean to us," she said softly. "They wanted to take me away." "I know," Declan replied, his jaw tightening. A dark, vengeful part of his mind told him to stay put, to let the people of Elkhorn suffer the consequences of their arrogance. They had treated him and Hazel like garbage, like disposable pests. Now the tables had turned. The outcasts were warm and fed, and the masters of the town were freezing in the dark. It felt like justice. But as the hours ticked by, the heat of the stove began to feel oppressive. Declan couldn't stop picturing the younger kids at the facility, kids like Lucas, who had always shared his meager snacks with Hazel. He couldn't stop thinking about the reality of freezing to death, the agonizing numbness, the slow slide into eternal sleep. Around noon, Declan heard a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a faint, desperate scraping noise coming from the ridge above the quarry. He grabbed his flashlight and carefully pushed the pallet door open a crack. He peered through the gap, his breath masking his face. Struggling through the waist-deep snow, moving at an agonizingly slow pace, were 3 figures. Declan recognized Chief Hamilton leading the way, using a broken tree branch as a walking stick. Behind him, stumbling and looking half dead, was Mr. Sterling. And bringing up the rear, his face pale and eyes glazed with hypothermia, was Brody, the high schooler who had kicked Declan's stove. They were heading toward the summit, likely looking for the old forestry watchtower, hoping to find an emergency radio or a wood stove. But Declan knew something they didn't. He had scouted the entire mountain 2 months ago. The watchtower had collapsed under heavy winds last spring. There was nothing up there but splintered wood and exposed rock. "Keep moving!" Chief Hamilton rasped, his voice hoarse and weak. "If we stop, we're dead. The tower's just over the next ridge. We can signal the state police from there." Mr. Sterling collapsed into a snowdrift, gasping. "I can't. My legs. I can't feel my legs." Brody fell to his knees next to him, shivering so violently his teeth sounded like castanets. "We're going to die out here, Chief. We should have stayed in the basement." "The basement is a tomb, son," Hamilton said, trying to haul Sterling up by his coat collar. "Get up. The radio is our only chance." Declan watched them from the dark crack of his cave. They were 50 yards away. If they continued up the mountain, they would find nothing. They would freeze to death before sunset. The storm had leveled the playing field, reducing the town's authority figures and bullies to desperate, dying animals. Declan closed the door, sliding the heavy wooden beam into place. He leaned against the stone wall, closing his eyes. "Let them walk," the dark voice in his head whispered. "They brought this on themselves. They mocked you. Keep your secret safe. Keep Hazel safe." "Declan." He opened his eyes. Hazel was standing right in front of him. She had heard the voices outside. She looked at the heavy door, then up at her brother. Her large, soulful eyes held no malice, only a profound, heartbreaking innocence. "Are those people going to die out in the cold?" she asked. Declan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat feeling like a jagged rock. "Probably, yes." Hazel looked back at the glowing warm stove. Then she looked at the stash of canned food, the insulated floor, the safe haven her brother had built with his bare hands. "Dad used to say that we shouldn't let mean people make us mean, too," Hazel whispered. Declan stared at her. The memory of his father's voice, warm and kind, echoed in the damp limestone cavern. He looked at his hands that were blistered and calloused from surviving, but also hands capable of saving lives. The anger that had fueled him for months suddenly felt hollow, replaced by a heavy, unavoidable burden of responsibility. He realized that true survival wasn't just about outlasting the storm. It was about outlasting the coldness in his own heart. He walked over to the stove, grabbed 2 pieces of burning pitch-soaked pine, and handed one to Hazel. "Put your coat on, Hayes," Declan said, his voice dropping an octave, solidifying into absolute resolve. "We have company." Declan pulled the locking beam back and shoved the pallet door open. He stepped out into the blinding white, the makeshift torch burning brightly in his hand, a beacon in the frozen wasteland. "Hey!" Declan yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Chief Hamilton, Mr. Sterling, and Brody froze. They turned their heads, squinting through the glare. There, standing on the ledge of the forbidden quarry, was the teenage orphan they had discarded, holding a flaming torch, radiating a heat they hadn't felt in days. "The watchtower's gone!" Declan shouted down to them, his voice slicing through the biting air. "It collapsed last spring. There's nothing up there but ice." Hamilton stared, disbelief etched into his frostbitten features. "Declan, is that you? How are you alive?" "I built a shelter," Declan called back, standing tall, no longer the frightened runaway, but the master of the mountain. "It's warm. We have a fire. We have food." Brody began to weep, tears freezing instantly on his cheeks. Mr. Sterling just stared, his mouth open, unable to comprehend that his salvation was standing in the form of the boy he had threatened to arrest. Declan looked down at the men who had mocked him, who had tried to take his sister away. He held out his hand. "Get up here," Declan commanded, "before you freeze to death." The bullies and the elite of Elkhorn didn't hesitate. Driven by the primal instinct to survive, they clawed their way up the icy slope, dragging their frozen limbs toward the very boy they had cast out into the cold, completely unaware of the magnificent subterranean fortress that awaited them inside the mountain. The journey from the exposed, wind-scoured ridge down to the limestone ledge was only 50 yards, but for the 3 freezing men, it was an agonizing marathon. Chief Hamilton moved with the stiff, uncoordinated gait of a man whose joints were rapidly locking up. Behind him, Brody crawled on his hands and knees, sobbing dry, tearless gasps. Mr. Sterling had to be half-dragged his expensive winter boots, dragging uselessly through the waist-deep powder. Declan stood by the narrow entrance, the makeshift pine torch, sputtering in the biting wind. He didn't offer a hand to pull them down the slope. He simply guarded the door, his posture rigid. When Chief Hamilton finally collapsed onto the cleared stone ledge, his chest heaving, he looked up at the 16-year-old boy. The authority the chief usually carried in town was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, desperate look of a dying animal. "Inside!" Declan ordered, his voice flat. He pointed to the dark fissure in the rock. "Move fast! Don't let the heat out!" Hamilton grabbed Brody by the collar of his jacket and shoved the teenager toward the gap. Brody squeezed through the narrow opening, instantly met by the profound, heavy warmth radiating from the cast-iron stove. Sterling came next, grunting in agony as his frozen legs scraped against the jagged limestone. Finally, Hamilton pushed his way in. Declan threw the torch into the snow, letting it hiss out, then slipped inside and immediately hauled the heavy reinforced pallet door shut. He slid the thick wooden crossbeam into the stone grooves, locking the freezing world outside. The silence inside the cavern was immediate and overwhelming. The men lay on the scavenged carpets, gasping for air. The temperature difference was violently sudden, from -10 degrees to nearly 70. It was enough to make the skin prickle and burn as dormant capillaries suddenly flared back to life. Brody was the first to speak. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his eyes wide as they adjusted to the golden light of the stove. He looked at the perfectly drafted PVC exhaust pipe. He saw the neat stacks of dry firewood, the plastic bins of canned food, the fiberglass insulation lining the freezing ground. You built this," Brody stammered, his teeth still chattering violently. He looked at the cast-iron stove radiating immense heat. "That's the stove from the dump. The one I kicked." "Yeah," Declan said, walking past the men to grab 3 tin mugs. He poured hot water from a pot resting on top of the stove into each mug. "It works just fine. Drink this. It's just water, but it's hot." Mr. Sterling was sitting against the far wall, gripping his thighs. His face was a pale, mottled gray. "My legs," he whimpered, the blustering hardware store owner reduced to a frightened child. "I can't feel them, boy. They're dead." Hazel, who had been sitting quietly in the corner clutching her corduroy rabbit, stood up. She walked over to one of the storage bins and pulled out 3 thick woolen blankets they had taken from the facility's laundry room months ago. She carried them over, draping one carefully over Mr. Sterling's shivering shoulders. Sterling looked down at the 9-year-old girl. This was the same child he had threatened to have arrested for stealing loose change to buy duct tape. Shame, thick and heavy, washed over his frostbitten face. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Declan knelt beside Sterling. He remembered reading a survival book in the facility's meager library. "Take your boots off, slowly. Don't rub your feet or you'll tear the frozen tissue. Just let them thaw near the stove." Chief Hamilton sat against a rock outcropping, sipping the hot water, his hands shaking so badly he spilled half of it on his coat. He watched Declan operate with a calm, surgical precision. The boy they had all written off as a delinquent, a burden on the state's budget, was standing in a fortress of his own making, outliving them all. "Declan!" Hamilton began, his voice rasping from the dry, cold air he had breathed for hours. "We thought you two were dead. Mrs. Grayson, the transport from the state came for Hazel. When you were gone, they thought you ran off into the woods right as the whiteout hit." "We did," Declan said coldly. He moved back to the stove, throwing another log inside. The fire crackled, casting long dancing shadows against the limestone walls. "We ran because you were going to take her to Seattle. You were going to split us up." Hamilton lowered his mug, looking deeply uncomfortable. "It was the state's decision, son. The facility was underfunded. And now the whole town is underfunded." Declan shot back, his eyes narrowing. "How bad is it down there, Chief? Really?" Hamilton closed his eyes, a profound exhaustion settling over his features. "It's a graveyard, Declan. The main power lines from the dam were sheared clean off by the ice. No grid, no backup. The snow is 4 feet deep on the flats, more in the drifts. The plows are buried. The roofs on Main Street are starting to buckle under the weight. Mayor Cobb is holed up in the town hall basement with maybe 20 people burning furniture to stay warm. But the rest of the town, he swallowed hard. People are trapped in their houses, no heat, the elderly, the kids. We tried to hike to the radio tower to call the National Guard because the cell towers are down. The tower collapsed last spring, Declan reminded him. You would have walked until you froze. I know, Hamilton said quietly. He looked around the cavern. How much food do you have here? Enough for me and Hazel, Declan replied, defensively stepping in front of the plastic bins. Not enough for a town. Brody wrapped his arms around his knees, crying softly. My mom is down there, in our house. She wouldn't leave. She said the town would fix the power. She's just wrapped in blankets. The heavy silence returned to the cave, save for the crackling of the fire. Declan looked at the men. He had saved them. He had done the moral thing. But Hamilton's words echoed in his mind. The elderly, the kids. Hazel tugged on the hem of Declan's jacket. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. Dec, what about Lucas and Clara? Are they freezing in the big house? Declan's stomach twisted. He pictured the Elkhorn Youth Transitional Facility, the drafty windows, the ancient boiler that barely worked on a good day. Mrs. Grayson might have been cruel, but the kids Lucas who used to sneak Hazel extra bread rolls, Clara who was only 6 years old, they didn't deserve to freeze in the dark. Chief, Declan said slowly, his voice tight with reluctance. The group home. Does Mrs. Grayson have a generator? Hamilton shook his head grimly. Died the first night. Rusted out. I saw Deputy Ford yesterday before I left. He said the kids were huddled in the gymnasium. That was 24 hours ago. In this cold, without a heat source. I don't know Declan. Declan turned away, pressing his palms against his eyes. The rage that had protected him for months was warring with a terrifying realization. He had built this sanctuary to escape Elkhorn, to let Elkhorn fade away, but he couldn't leave children to die. If he did, the sanctuary would become a tomb for his conscience. Brody. Declan snapped, turning back around. The teenager jumped. You stay here. Watch the stove. Keep the fire hot, but don't overfeed it or you'll crack the cast iron. Keep Mr. Sterling awake. Brody nodded frantically. Okay, I can do that. Declan looked at the chief. Hamilton, can you walk? The older man frowned, confused. Barely. Why? Declan began pulling on his heavy canvas work coat. He wrapped a thick scarf around his face. He grabbed a coil of scavenged nylon rope from a corner. Because we're going down there. We're going to the facility. Hamilton stared at him as if he had lost his mind. Declan, that's suicide. It's a mile down the mountain. The snow is waist deep. We barely made it up. You made it up because you didn't know where you were going, Declan countered. I know this mountain. I know the switchbacks. We can use the old logging chute to slide down past the worst drifts. If we don't go now, Lucas and those kids are going to be dead by nightfall. And if you don't help me, I'll go by myself. Hamilton looked at the boy's hardened expression. He slowly put his mug down and with a groan of immense effort forced himself back to his feet. All right, son. You lead the way. Hazel ran to Declan, wrapping her arms around his waist. Be careful, Dec. Please. Declan knelt down, hugging her tightly. I will, Hayes. You stay here. Keep the door locked. Don't open it for anyone but me. Understood. Understood, she whispered. Declan stood, pulled the heavy beam back, and shoved the pallet door open. The blinding white world waited for them. He and the chief stepped out onto the ledge, pulling the door shut behind them, leaving the warmth behind to descend into the frozen apocalypse of Elkhorn. The descent was far more treacherous than the climb up. The snow had crusted over with a thin layer of ice from the brief morning sun, creating a deceptively fragile surface that broke under their weight, plunging them thigh-deep into the powder with every step. Declan led the way, relying on muscle memory and the tops of the tallest pine trees to navigate the buried trail. The wind had died down, but the air temperature was brutally cold, freezing the moisture in their nostrils the moment they inhaled. Chief Hamilton moved slowly, his face wrapped tightly in his scarf, following the deep tracks Declan was carving into the snow. "Watch your step here," Declan shouted back over his shoulder. "There's a drop-off under the drift. Hug the tree line." They reached the old logging chute an hour later. It was a steep natural ravine the timber companies had used decades ago to slide logs down the mountain. Now it was a smooth, terrifyingly steep slide of packed snow. "We slide down," Declan said, unwinding the nylon rope from his shoulder. He tied one end around his waist and handed the other to Hamilton. "If one of us starts to tumble, the other acts as an anchor. Keep your feet forward." Hamilton didn't argue. He sat down in the snow, gripping the rope. Declan pushed off first. The slide was dizzying and dangerous. The wind whipped at their faces as they gained speed. Declan used his boots as makeshift brakes, digging his heels into the crust to slow their descent. Twice, Hamilton lost his balance and began to tumble, but the rope held taut, Declan slamming his body into a snowbank to arrest their fall. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long, haunting blue shadows across the buried town. Elkhorn was utterly silent. It didn't look like a town anymore. It looked like a collection of strange white mounds. Cars were completely invisible. Stop signs barely poked above the surface. Here and there, dark, jagged holes in roofs marked where the weight of the snow had caused structural collapses. Declan and Hamilton trudged down what used to be Elm Street, heading toward the eastern edge of town where the facility sat. As they passed houses, Declan could see frost clinging to the inside of the windows. He forced himself not to look too closely, afraid of what or who he might see inside. When the Elkhorn Youth Transitional Facility finally came into view, Declan's heart sank. The old brick building looked abandoned. Massive icicles, some 6 feet long, hung like fangs from the gutters. The front entrance was completely snowed in. "Around the back," Declan said, his voice muffled by his scarf. "The delivery bay doors. The wind usually blows the snow clear of that corner." They waded through the deep drifts around the perimeter. Declan was right. The concrete ramp leading down to the kitchen loading dock was partially clear. Declan kicked the frozen handle of the metal door. It didn't budge. He kicked it again harder, his boot echoing loudly in the dead silence. Finally, with a sickening crack of ice, the door gave way. The air inside the facility was foul. It smelled of backed-up plumbing, stale sweat and freezing dampness. It was darker inside than out the narrow windows blocked by snow. Declan clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. "Mrs. Grayson," Hamilton called out, his voice hoarse. Only silence answered. Declan led the way down the linoleum hallway toward the gymnasium. His flashlight beam swept over discarded coats, overturned chairs, and a broken mop bucket. The cold inside the building felt heavier, more oppressive than the open air. It was the cold of a tomb. He reached the double doors of the gymnasium and pushed them open. The sight made Declan stop dead in his tracks. In the very center of the large wooden floor, 20 mattresses had been dragged together into a massive pile. Huddled beneath every blanket, sleeping bag, and curtain they could find were the wards of Elkhorn. They were grouped tightly together, trying to share whatever meager body heat they had left. Sitting on the edge of the pile, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, was Mrs. Grayson. She looked up as the flashlight beam hit her. Her face was gaunt, her lips blue, and her eyes hollow with despair. She looked like a ghost. "Chief," she croaked, squinting against the light. "Is that you? Did you bring help?" Hamilton stepped forward, shining his own light around the room. "I brought Declan." Mrs. Grayson's eyes widened as they locked onto the teenage boy. "Declan, you're alive. We thought—" She choked on her words. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't keep them warm. I tried. The generator died. We burned the chairs in the trash can, but the smoke. We couldn't breathe. They're so cold." Declan walked up to the pile of mattresses. He recognized Lucas, shivering violently, his eyes closed. Next to him was little Maya, clutching a dirty blanket, her breathing shallow and raspy. "Are they all alive?" Declan asked, his voice shaking. Mrs. Grayson nodded weakly. "Yes, but barely. If we stay another night, I don't think the little ones will wake up." Declan turned to Hamilton. "We have to move them, now." "Move them where?" Mrs. Grayson asked, confusion fighting through her lethargy. "The whole town is dead." "Not the whole town," Declan said fiercely. "Get them up. Everyone who can walk needs to carry someone who can't. Put on every layer of clothing you have." Hamilton stepped up, his authoritative voice finally returning, fueled by the desperate need to save the kids. "Listen to the boy, Grayson. Get them up. We are evacuating this building." It took 30 agonizing minutes to rouse the freezing, lethargic children. Declan practically had to drag Lucas to his feet, slapping his cheeks to wake him up. They layered the kids in 3, sometimes 4 coats. They wrapped scarves over their faces and put socks on their hands when they ran out of gloves. Mrs. Grayson watched Declan orchestrate the evacuation. The boy she had called disruptive, the boy she had tried to expel from her system, was now the only one with a plan. "Declan," she whispered as he handed her a flashlight. "Where are we taking them?" Declan looked at the woman who had made his life a misery for 3 years. He felt no anger anymore, only the primal driving instinct to survive. "Up," Declan said. "We're going into the mountain." The exodus from the facility was a slow, torturous crawl. 22 people, including 20 children, stepping out into the fading light of the frozen apocalypse. Declan led the line, cutting a path through the snow, while Chief Hamilton brought up the rear, physically pushing the stragglers to keep them moving. They didn't go toward the logging chute. Climbing that steep incline with freezing children was impossible. They had to take the long way, winding up the switchback trails that cut through the pines. The sun set, completely plunging the mountain into an inky, terrifying darkness. The only light came from Declan and Hamilton's flashlights sweeping over the blinding white snow. "Keep moving!" Declan shouted, his voice cracking from the cold. "Don't stop. If you stop, you freeze." Lucas stumbled and fell, burying his face in the snow. He didn't try to get up. Declan dropped back, grabbed the boy by his coat collar, and hauled him upright. "Come on, Lucas. Remember when you gave Hazel your apple at lunch? I owe you. You don't get to quit on me." Lucas nodded sluggishly, his eyes half closed, and forced his legs to move. The climb took 3 hours. It was a battle against the elements, against gravity, and against the overwhelming urge to just lie down and sleep. Several of the younger children were crying, their tears freezing to their eyelashes. Mrs. Grayson carried 6-year-old Maya, the older woman, finding a reservoir of strength born entirely of guilt and adrenaline. When they finally broke through the tree line and reached the ledge of the old quarry, the wind picked up again, threatening to blow them off the edge. Declan ran to the stone face and pounded his fist against the wood. "Hazel, open up, it's me!" A moment later, the heavy beam scraped back. The pallet door swung open and the brilliant golden light of the fire spilled out onto the snow. Brody was standing inside, feeding a log into the stove. Hazel stood beside him, holding a stack of blankets. "Inside, quick!" Declan yelled, grabbing the children and pulling them through the narrow entrance. They poured into the cavern, collapsing onto the carpets, crying and gasping as the sudden intense heat washed over them. It was crowded. 25 people crammed into a space meant for 2. The air grew thick with the smell of wet wool, melting snow, and unwashed bodies. But it was warm. It was alive. Mrs. Grayson was the last one in, carried by Chief Hamilton. As Declan slammed the door shut and locked it, the older woman collapsed against the limestone wall, staring in sheer disbelief at the subterranean haven. She saw the stove, the exhaust, the carefully hoarded food, the insulation. She looked at Hazel, who was moving among the crying children, handing out tin cups of warm water. Mrs. Grayson began to cry, not the quiet, dignified tears of an administrator, but the ugly, racking sobs of someone who had entirely misunderstood the world. For the next 2 days, the cavern was a cramped, chaotic hospital ward. Declan and Hazel's hoarded food was rationed out: a spoonful of peanut butter and half a cup of cold beans per person twice a day. They melted snow in pots on the stove for drinking water. They took turns sleeping as there wasn't enough floor space for everyone to lie down at once. Mr. Sterling, his legs slowly regaining a painful throbbing feeling, told stories to the younger kids to keep them distracted. Brody helped Declan chop the remaining firewood, their past animosity completely erased by the shared trauma of the cold. On the morning of the 7th day since the storm began, the heavy silence outside the mountain was broken by a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thumping that vibrated through the stone. Declan stood up, his heart racing. He unlatched the door and pushed it open. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue. The storm had finally broken. Hovering over the valley, casting large shadows over the buried town of Elkhorn, were 3 olive-green National Guard UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. One of the choppers banked sharply its rotors, kicking up a massive cloud of powder, and began to slowly descend toward the wide, flat expanse of the old quarry ledge. "They found us," Chief Hamilton breathed, stepping out onto the ledge beside Declan, shielding his eyes from the rotor wash. He looked down at the boy. "You did it, son. You saved them. You saved us all." The evacuation took hours. The National Guard medics were astounded to find 25 survivors in a hidden cave, treating minor frostbite and severe dehydration, but finding no fatalities. When they loaded the last of the children into the helicopters, Mrs. Grayson turned to the lead medic. "The boy," she said, pointing to Declan, who was standing near the cave entrance holding Hazel's hand tightly. "He built the shelter. He hiked down and pulled us out of the ice. If it weren't for him, there would be 20 graves down there." The medic looked at Declan with profound respect. As they prepared to board the final chopper, a man in a thick state agency jacket approached Mrs. Grayson. He was the coordinator from Seattle arriving with the rescue teams. "Mrs. Grayson," the man yelled over the roar of the rotors, "I have the paperwork for the girl. We can expedite her transfer to the foster family in Seattle today." Declan's blood ran cold. After everything, the state machine was still grinding. He stepped in front of Hazel, his jaw set, preparing to fight the man right there on the ledge. But Mrs. Grayson stepped forward. She placed a firm hand on the state worker's chest. "No." Mrs. Grayson said, her voice louder and stronger than it had been in years. "The transfer is canceled." The worker looked confused. "Ma'am, it's already in the system. The boy is aging out and the girl needs a home." "She has a home," Mrs. Grayson said, pointing to Declan. "And he is not aging out into the streets. He's staying in Elkhorn. In fact, Mayor Cobb and I are going to make sure he has a permanent placement here, together." Chief Hamilton stepped up beside her, crossing his massive arms. "You try to take that girl, you're going to have to arrest the chief of police, son. Tell Seattle to lose the paperwork." The worker, outnumbered and sensing the immovable resolve of the survivors, slowly nodded and backed away. Declan looked at Mrs. Grayson, then at Hamilton. For the first time since his parents died, he didn't feel the need to run. He looked down at Hazel, who was clutching her corduroy rabbit, a massive smile breaking across her face. They boarded the helicopter, leaving the cavern behind. As the Black Hawk lifted off, banking over the pristine, deadly white peaks of the Cascades, Declan looked down at the dark fissure in the limestone. It was no longer a place of desperate exile. It was a monument to their survival. The town of Elkhorn would rebuild, but it would never be the same. The Mockery was dead, buried under the ice, and the outcasts had become the architects of their salvation. Are you blown away by the incredible twist of fate in this survival story? Declan and Hazel went from mocked outcasts to the absolute heroes of Elkhorn, proving that underestimating the underdogs is the biggest mistake you can make. If your heart was pounding during that desperate descent and rescue, please smash that like button and share this epic tale of survival with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another thrilling real-life survival story. We want to hear from you. What would you have done in Declan's shoes? Would you have risked your haven to save the town? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.